Hello and welcome back. This is the week 2 lecture. So today we continue to talk about some of our reading strategies that we need to master this semester as we read sources, tackle difficult texts, and just do the type of reading that we typically do in English 102. So last week we talked about some basic active reading strategies, underlining, annotating, and asking questions. I want us to continue to do all of those things. That's not just something for week 1 or the first few weeks. Those are strategies that we need to implement throughout the semester for anything that we read in here. And here in week 2, we're moving into sort of the next phase of that, the next stage. So we're still talking about taking notes, asking questions, doing some of that basic stuff, but now we're going to talk a little bit more about advanced annotation. Some more sophisticated, complex questions that you might need to ask, some different areas that you might need to dive into in order to understand some of the sources that you read this semester. So the stuff I'm going to go over today will often make its way into your annotations. This will be stuff that you can jot down. These can be things that you can think about, ways to generate ideas. It just gives you more potential content for later. It gives you more to write about, more to think about, more to ask about. And once you find answers or, sort of reach your own conclusions, you're going to have more to say, more to do when you later work with those sources. So this is just more stuff for your annotations, more stuff for notes, questions, the summaries that you write, but then ultimately we can start, using this stuff when we analyze and also when we make arguments of our own. So I just want to go through some of these basic terms. You can find all of this stuff also in the week 2 overview. But I want to talk a little bit more about these ideas. A lot of the concepts should be familiar to you. You've probably learned about some of this stuff before. Maybe you've worked with some of this stuff in previous English classes. So it's not so much that it's all new. It's just, again, similar to last week. There's a lot of different ways to approach these things. We're already sort of equipped to do the work, so now it's just a matter of doing it. Like I was saying last week, there's no one set way to write annotations or to highlight or underline. There's a lot of ways of doing it. It's not really a right or a wrong. You just have to find a style, a technique that works for you, as long as it's helping you to remember and understand. And that's also true of what we're covering this week. The way you think about these concepts, the way you approach these different areas of the sources that you read, there's not really a right way or a wrong way. There's just your way. And you have to find the best way for you. So it's not about getting it right or wrong. It's just about being willing to do the work, being willing to go through these categories, generate thoughts and ideas, write those ideas down, and then be ready to work with them more in the future. So let's start with a term that we definitely know, a word that we've heard before, certainly in an academic context, thesis. This is the central statement of a text's purpose, or the expression of the central idea or the main argument that a text is making. So we've often thought about our own thesis statements. I'm sure we've all had to write a paper at some point, probably in a previous English class, when you were told to develop your own thesis. And sometimes that can be a challenge. That might be something that we are still working on. And eventually, in this class, we will think about our own thesis statements once we start writing argumentative papers of our own. But first, early in the semester, we have to think more about the thesis statements of the authors we read. We have to get comfortable identifying what their arguments are. And we might not always know with 100% certainty. And sometimes that can trip students up. They can be like, well, I don't know what his argument is. I haven't talked to this person directly. I've read their article, but I don't know exactly what's going on in their mind. I don't know all of their intentions or motivations. And that's true. So to a certain extent, we're making educated guesses. We're using all available evidence that we have in front of us. And that doesn't mean we're going to know everything, but it means we can know enough to do the kind of work that we have to do in this class. We can remember what we read, we can understand it, at least for the most part, we can summarize it, we can analyze it, and then eventually we can use it to benefit us. One important thing, oftentimes with thesis, we think argument. And that's a good way to think about it, I would say, in this class. Because eventually we're going to have arguments of our own. And often the sources that you read are making arguments themselves. So that's often what you're trying to identify. That's what the thesis will be. What is the argument of this particular article or book or website that you're reading? But some students can get a little bit boxed in if they only think about a thesis as being argumentative. Oftentimes, they will be. A lot of the thesis statements that we're trying to find or summarize or understand, they will be argumentative. They are advancing a particular position, a particular viewpoint. You might agree with it. You might not agree with it. You might need to think more about it to determine how you feel. But often what we read will be argumentative in nature, even if it doesn't immediately seem that way. But not everything is argumentative. Some sources that we read might have more of an informative bent. Sometimes they might have, different purposes, different reasons for existing, and you might not always really see the author as necessarily making an argument. You might think that they're trying to do something else. Maybe they're mostly trying to inform us. Maybe they're, serving some other function. That's fine. If you want to think of the thesis as more of the purpose of the source, that can work well too. Because if you're thinking about it as the larger purpose, then it could be an argument, or it might be something else. If you think that source has a purpose that's not necessarily argumentative, maybe it's more informative, or it's something else, then that's fine. You can still find a thesis. You can still talk about a thesis, even if you don't think it is strictly argumentative. All right? But there's always going to be some kind of a thesis that we can identify. But another important thing to keep in mind is that what you're reading might not always have a clear thesis statement that you can just underline or circle and say, oh, there it is. It does work out that way sometimes, and it's nice when it does. But you have to remember that the authors you're reading, these scholars, these journalists, these commentators, they're not in English 102, right? They're not necessarily following the same academic writing rules that you guys have to follow on your written assignments. So as you know from taking English classes in the past, you have to have a thesis statement in most of your English papers, a thesis statement that your instructor can easily find and identify. You've probably been told that typically you put that thesis near the end of your intro paragraph, or perhaps no later than your second paragraph. So you generally follow that rule, and because we have to follow it in here, we might sort of assume that the other authors that we read are also following that rule, but of course many of them are not. They are not writing an essay for English class. They are operating in different realms, different worlds, where there's different rules and standards and expectations. So in a lot of articles, a lot of book chapters, the types of things that we read in here, sometimes you're not going to find an actual thesis statement. because the author doesn't really have to write one. They need to make their argument or their overall point or purpose clear, but they don't have to distill it into one or two sentences. I mean, sometimes they will, just because that's kind of a good thing to do as a writer, but then in other cases, they don't. They let it become clear over a longer period of time. It might not really become clear what their purpose is until near the end of the piece, or maybe around the midway point. You might have to read several paragraphs before it starts to take shape for you. And that's okay, but you just need to be prepared for that. Don't always go in expecting to find one clear thesis statement. And a lot of students want to find it, right? Because in our own work, we've been taught to have something like that that's easy to identify, easy to locate. But these other sources aren't always going to be that way. So be prepared in some cases to have to recreate the thesis in your own words. A lot of students want to find something that they can underline or highlight and say, okay, that's the thesis, I think, more or less. And it might be on the right track, but a lot of times it doesn't quite function that way because maybe the argument's a little bit more complex. And yeah, that sentence sort of gets us into it, but there's more to come. Or maybe the author complicates it a little bit later and the student isn't taking that into account. So in the cases where you can't really find one or two sentences that you're confident could really serve as a thesis, don't worry. It's just up to you to recreate the author's argument in your own words. And honestly, that's kind of a better practice for you guys anyway. It's nice to just find a thesis and say, oh, there it is, problem solved. But if you really want to remember and understand the text, you need to be able to express the author's argument or their larger point in your own words. That's always a good thing to do because it really demonstrates your own knowledge, your own mastery of their ideas. Remember, there's this kind of translation occurring, like we talked about last week. You're reading another person. They use language differently than you. They think differently than you. They might have certain experiences and knowledge that could be different from what you possess, right? So it's fine to just circle what they say, but it's always good to then take the next step and to take their language, their ideas, and translate it into terms, sentences of your own. Your own language, your own tone, your own structure, because you're always going to be able to better understand it that way. And if you can show me that you can sort of summarize an author's argument in your own words, that's always encouraging for me. That gives you more confidence and it gets you ready for the later work that we're going to do. So even if you do think you find a true thesis statement in a source, you still want to summarize it or paraphrase it using your own words. Do it for yourself so you know that you understand it. And also, in some cases, you might have to do it for my benefit as well. So we're always hunting for the thesis of any source that we read. But like I've said, don't get frustrated if you don't immediately know it. You might have to read the whole article before you know it. You might have to read the article more than once before you're clear on the thesis. Just be patient. With some, it's going to be easy to find. With others, it will be more difficult, but you'll be okay either way. So one more thing on thesis before we move on. Don't get it confused for topic, okay? The topic is what an article is about, okay? It is the subject matter that the article is covering. That's not the same thing as thesis, right? The thesis is the argument, the overall point, or the purpose. And you have to kind of figure that out for yourself. The topic is always easy to identify. The topic is often announced in the title, right? The topic is often announced, if not in the title of the text, then in the first sentence or two of the text. The topic just means, what is it about? The thesis means, what is it saying? What is the argument? What is the larger purpose? All right, so let's move on to a very related concept, similar to thesis, but a little bit different. Intention. Okay, what is the author's intention? What are they trying to do? So I kind of gave you a hint about this when we were talking about thesis. Authors can do different things. They can have a wide variety of different intentions. So one very popular, common intention is to persuade. That's when they are making a clear argument. They are trying to get their readers to accept a particular position or a particular point of view. And usually we can tell when an author is doing that, right? Because they need to be pretty clear about what they want their readers to think and feel. Again, it might take a while for that to become clear, but at least by the end of your reading, you should have a sense of whether or not they're trying to persuade you of something. But that's not the only intention an author can have. Like I mentioned before, sometimes an author might be trying to inform. They are simply providing information so that readers can arrive at their own conclusions. Often we might think that about certain neutral sounding news sources. So for example, those 2 newspaper articles I had you guys read back in week 1, you could certainly make the case that to some extent they were making arguments, but I think a lot of students and other readers would sort of interpret those particular texts as largely informative. There were a few moments where we might have detected a larger point or purpose, maybe an argumentative purpose on the part of at least one of those authors, but maybe the primary intention that many people would have picked up on with those would have been to inform the public about things that are going on, recent developments, things that are happening. Where do we stand? What does that person say? What does this other person say? What is the debate? What is the argument that's going on? And maybe we don't really feel like the author is necessarily picking a side or taking a firm stand. Often they are, maybe just in kind of a subtle way, but if it doesn't immediately jump off the page, it's fine to sort of think, well, this is mostly informative, right? No human is completely free of opinion and judgment, but if you think the primary purpose, the primary intention of the author is to inform, then you can run with that and you can certainly think that. In other cases, the author might want us to analyze something. They might want us to simply have an emotional reaction. In some cases, that can be a little bit different than just argumentation or being informative. Right? If we think it's more of an emotional wavelength, we're supposed to feel maybe more than we're supposed to think. That could be a different intention that we could potentially identify. And we'll also notice that many authors have multiple intentions. They're not just trying to do one thing. So perhaps they're trying to inform us, but then they also want to persuade us. Or maybe they want us to have an emotional reaction while also changing our minds about a particular topic. So these are not mutually exclusive. A lot of these intentions coexist, overlap, and are happening simultaneously. And we also want to be a little bit careful because, like I was saying before, we don't know these authors. We are not having personal conversations with them, so we don't want to fall into speculating too much about what an author thinks, or the politics that an author might have, or the life experiences that a particular author may or may not have. We really want to stick to what we see in the text. Now, of course, you can always Google a lot of these authors. You can learn a little bit more about them, and sometimes that can be useful. But generally, we want to stick with the evidence on the page, the evidence in the text. What do we see? What's actually happening in the article? And let's base our educated guesses, our hypotheses about purpose and intention, let's base all of that on what's actually in the text. We don't need to really get into these authors' personal lives, even though we might be able to, thanks to Google. We don't need to speculate too much about what they think and how they feel and the kind of people they are. Let's stick to the text. And we can do a lot just with what's there. All right? Even though we don't know everything, we know enough to start forming opinions, to start not only are we better able to remember and understand, but now we're really starting to acquire the material necessary for analysis. Right? We're starting to think more critically about the sources, so now we can do more than just summarize them, more than just remember them. Now we can analyze them, evaluate them, and get ready to use them in various ways. All right, so let's move on to bias, something that no one is free from. So we have to understand that, yes, all humans have some degree of bias. It's just part of being a person. Bias means a preconceived prejudice or preference. So everybody has some of these, right? Things that we just naturally prefer. We like certain things better than other things. And even though we try to overcome, we all have certain prejudices. They might not be, filled with hate or targeted towards specific people, but they might just be, again, based on our own likes and dislikes, things that we think or feel that make us predisposed to believing certain things or sort of taking certain positions. Doesn't mean that we're always wrong when doing that. It just means that we're a little slanted. Right? We prefer one thing to the other thing, so we're going to favor the thing that we prefer, right? Because it's more natural to us, and we typically like that more than things that are perhaps foreign to us, a little bit stranger, or outside of our own experience. So everybody has some degree of this, and that's going to be true of all the authors that we read. So accept that, be okay with that, and don't get too stressed out about who's biased and who's not, because we can just assume that everybody is to a certain extent. But we're trying to uncover any problematic bias that we might be able to detect in the authors that we're reading, in the texts that we are finding through research. And even if you do decide that a particular text might have a particular bias, doesn't mean that you have to throw that text out. It doesn't mean that it might not be a valuable service to you. It might still be a good source that you could use on your research paper. You just need to be aware of the bias that might influence the author in certain ways. You don't have to reject the source because of it, but you need to be aware of that bias. You might even need to acknowledge it, talk about it. It might at least make an appearance in your notes, because you're going to need to grapple with it and consider it when you're analyzing or responding to the source. So this is one of those times where knowing a bit more about an author could be useful. And if this is an author that's published a lot, you can always Google them and find more about them online. Sometimes we might determine that an author has a little bit of a conflict of interest, like maybe they are taking a particular position or arguing for a certain thing because they benefit from that thing, or they are sort of a part of that movement, or they are somehow involved in decision making, right? Again, doesn't mean that their position is invalid. It's just good to know. It helps you to better understand what they're doing, and it will allow you to make more informed choices when you're responding to the text or figuring out how you're going to use the text, if you're sort of aware of this stuff. So I use this example a lot. This really happened several semesters ago, and I'm changing some of the names and details just to, avoid any problems. But this really did happen to a student of mine a while back. She was doing her research paper on food. It's like certain issues surrounding food and like healthy food versus processed food. I honestly don't remember her entire argument, but she had found a particular source written by a scientist who had previously worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And his article was kind of interesting and unusual because he was actually sort of defending fast food, and he would not completely, it was a little more nuanced than that, but he was just arguing that that fast food's not as bad as a lot of people think, a lot of parents, tend to think, and he was sort of making a case that a certain degree of fast food consumption isn't really that bad for people, especially kids. I believe the student's focus was on childhood nutrition, and this article was kind of specifically about kids eating fast food. So she brought the article to me, and she was like, I see who the author is. I see that he appears very qualified. He's a scientist. He works for a government agency. I'm assuming this isn't particularly biased info, but she was just struck by how strange of an argument it was compared to most of the other stuff she was reading. So we did a little bit more digging about the author, and it turns out that he had previously worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, but he no longer did, which is fine. That's his choice. He went into the private sector and was currently, as of that particular semester, when this was like maybe 2019, at that point, he was a consultant working for agribusiness, like big food manufacturers, and he specifically focused on fast food, basically sort of arguing in favor of people eating fast food, right? He was working for a business that sold their products specifically to fast food restaurants. So once we discovered that, my student's first instinct was to just throw the article out. She was like, oh, okay, well, if that's what he's up to, then I'm not going to use this. And I told her it was really her call, right? I was like, it's good to know. You can form your own conclusions about what this guy's doing based on what we've read, based on what we've seen, but you can still use his article. You don't have to throw it out, but now you can be a little bit more knowledgeable about what's going on. You can form your own opinions, and it's just better to know than not to know. And ultimately, she did use the article, but she kind of pushed back on it. She kind of used it as an example of an opposing viewpoint that she wanted to sort of disprove. And she did mention that he was a bit conflicted because the argument that he was making was obviously benefiting his bottom line. But everybody's different. Some people really wouldn't be very bothered by that. And they would say, as long as the facts check out, as long as his research holds up, I don't care that he's personally benefiting from the argument. So it's really a personal choice, and everybody will handle it a little bit differently, but knowledge is power. You need to know if there is a bias that might have an influence on what the author is doing. Ultimately, you get to decide how important that bias is to you and whether or not you think it's something that you have to address or kind of navigate. But you need to know it in order to make some of those important decisions. All right, so let's move on to the fourth thing for today, tone. We all know what this word means, but we often use it in the context of speech. You can always tell a person's tone of voice. And a person's tone of voice can tell you a lot about how that person feels, like what emotional state that person is currently in. It can tell you what they're after, what they're trying to accomplish or get. There's a lot of clues that can be provided through tone. Tone tells you a lot about the speaker and about what the speaker wants, how the speaker feels, and what the speaker is doing. But don't forget, tone also applies to written language. Any text that we read has a tone. Just like somebody talking will always have a particular tone. So you'll see different tones. You'll experience different tones in different texts. But typically, if we are reading academic or scholarly texts, like stuff from academic journals, or maybe a scholarly book, or even an EDU website, or a page on a school website created by a professor and his students, oftentimes the tone of those kinds of texts will strike us as a little bit dry, maybe a little dull. And as I mentioned last week, it's important to remember that a lot of these kinds of sources, academic sources like these, they're not designed to entertain us. They are not designed to be thrilling beach reads. They are designed to be informative, perhaps persuasive. They're often designed for experts, people who know a lot about the subject matter. So the tone will often be sort of difficult for us when we are reading sources like that. We might often feel like, there's not much humor, there's not a lot of personality, there's going to be a lot of statistics, a lot of hard evidence. So we can see that there's good info. We can tell that this author is very knowledgeable and they have a lot of interesting or, useful info, but the way that stuff is packaged, the way it is presented to us as readers might not always be super fun or enjoyable to read. And that's okay. You can certainly feel a little bit bored at times as you're making your way through these sources, but don't fall asleep and don't allow the boring tone to drive you away. Don't allow that boring tone to make you think, oh, well, I'm not even going to bother because I don't like this. Sometimes you have to suffer through it a little bit because it will be a valuable source. And yes, it's going to be a little bit tougher to understand it, to summarize it, to talk about it, but you can still get there. It just takes a little more effort, maybe some more note-taking, more question-asking than you would ordinarily do, but you can still get to your ultimate destination. And yeah, a lot of these sources are pretty complex. They can be difficult to understand, especially if you're outside of that area of specialization. Right? Like try reading an article from an academic science journal if you're not a scientist or at least a science major. A lot of the language is going to be unfamiliar. A lot of their research methods will be very unfamiliar. That's a different world. You're not necessarily in that world. But you can learn about it, you can navigate it. Using these active reading strategies will help. But remember, as I mentioned last week, sometimes you just have to look stuff up. If you come across a word or a concept, a name, an event that you don't recognize, or I've never learned about that, I don't know what that is, Google it. Google it. Find out. There's probably a Wikipedia page. There's probably some easy reference materials that you can gather just through a quick Google search. And then you can return to the source. I know that can be a little annoying, but sometimes it is necessary. Now, that's not going to be all the sources that we read. Not all of our sources will be academic or scholarly. Sometimes we're going to read what will be called popular sources. And this would include newspaper articles, magazine articles, maybe even some websites. And the information in these sources is still good, but it's going to be packaged and presented in a different way. Usually popular sources are pretty easy to read. You'll notice that they're often shorter. Right, if you compare, especially a newspaper article, to an article from an academic journal, like, there's a huge difference in length. The average newspaper article is really only a couple of pages, whereas the average length of an academic article might be closer to 15 or 20 pages. So that's a significant difference. Right? Newspaper articles usually, not always, but usually are written and intended to be read quickly. Right? They're intended to be sort of easily consumable. Pretty easy to understand. They're often going to have evidence, facts, maybe statistics, but probably not as much as those academic journal articles. They're not going to be as densely packed with info compared to, the more academic sources that I was previously discussing. So for this reason, obviously, a lot of students prefer newspaper articles, magazine articles, stuff they find on websites, just because they're shorter, they're easier, easier to remember, easier to understand, and ultimately easier to talk about. And that's okay. You can certainly use a lot of these popular sources, but we need some academic sources too. We like to have a balance. And of course, we know that with magazine articles, newspaper articles, most of those are written by journalists. And that's fine. Journalists are usually pretty reliable sources, but you should keep in mind the difference between a journalist and, say, a scientist or some other expert or academic who works in a particular field. So those academic or scholarly sources are typically written by doctors, scientists, professors, people who are experts in the field. But because they are first and foremost experts in the field and not entertainment writers, right, that's often why their tone seems dry and rather, academic. Sounds like something you would get in a classroom, not something that you'd want to read for pleasure, right? So that's fine. That's just the way it is. But we know that those people writing the academic sources are usually experts. They're usually people who have researched the area. They've written about it, taught about it widely, and for a long time. Maybe that doesn't mean a whole lot to us, but it does mean that those are the most reliable sources. They're also peer-reviewed. Academic sources are peer-reviewed. That means my academic background is in American literature. So if I was to write an academic article about American literature, before it gets published, it would be reviewed by other scholars in that field, my peers. Other people like me would look at it and sort of sign off on it, make sure it's accurate, make sure it's doing what it's supposed to do, make sure I haven't made any unintentional mistakes, because those happen. And they're going to vet it before it ever gets published. So that process, along with the nature of the authors of these kinds of academic sources, make us usually very confident in their reliability. Newspapers and magazines are kind of one notch lower in the reliability hierarchy. They're still reliable, just not as reliable as the stuff produced by experts and then peer-reviewed by other experts. Right? A newspaper article does not get peer-reviewed. It goes through an editorial process. It gets edited mostly for language to make sure it sounds good and doesn't have any grammatical errors. But, as we know, sometimes journalists might get stuff wrong, and journalists and academics can too. But the important thing is journalists aren't necessarily experts in the subject matter that they're writing about. They know something about it because they cover it and they talk to experts. but they might not necessarily be experts themselves, right? So they can interview experts, they can summarize what experts have said, but they're not necessarily experts themselves. And they are writing for a more popular, wider audience. That's another thing to remember with journalists writing for newspapers, magazines, websites. They have a different audience than those scholars in the academic journals do. The scholars are usually writing for other scholars or advanced college students. Whereas a newspaper or magazine writer, they're writing for a general audience. That's why we call it a popular source, because it's for almost anyone. Basically, any literate adult can pick up a news magazine or a newspaper and be able to read most of what's in there and understand it. You might not know everything, but you can get a pretty general understanding if you're at least, a teenager, and obviously you are literate. So, because of that, the style and the tone of those newspaper and magazine articles will be different. They're more likely to try to entertain us or to try to hook us, make us interested. Some of what we call sort of long-form journalism is often very much written to be entertaining and compelling. Like longer articles that are a little bit more developed. Often they might have some humor, some narrative elements, like they're kind of telling us a story. They're trying to engage our emotions. Those can often be really good reads, and a lot of journalists are really good writers. So they're able to hook us and grab our interest kind of the same way a really good novelist or short story writer would, by sort of creating an interesting narrative and making us care about what's going on. Again, scholars, the academic writers, they're not necessarily doing that. But also, newspapers aren't always doing that either. Some shorter newspaper articles are just designed to inform, primarily. They're short, they're easy to get through, and they might not be the most entertaining, but they're typically pretty easy to grasp. So you got to be aware there's a lot of difference between the different sources that we read, even between a short newspaper article and a much longer, more in-depth magazine article. There's going to be differences there that you have to kind of learn and navigate as we go. But just have that basic distinction between academic sources and popular sources in mind. We tend to gravitate more towards the popular sources because they are easier, but we really want both. We want the popular stuff, the stuff for a general audience, and also the academic stuff that's designed for a more specialized audience. And then finally, let's talk more about audience. The fifth big concept that I wanted to cover for advanced annotation is audience. You always want to try to determine what audience the author is addressing. And again, we're speculating a little bit here. We don't always know 100%, but we can use the evidence available to us. And I've already told you the big tip, right? If it's an academic journal article or a scholarly book, you know the audience is mostly an academic or specialized audience. Other doctors, scientists, experts, but also potentially you guys. Because a lot of that stuff is also written for college students. People who are going into those fields. Not just people who are already experts, but people who will one day be experts. A lot of academic articles are also kind of intended for students, advanced undergrads, and also graduate students. So you might find yourself in some of these intended audiences, if not now, maybe in a few years, depending on what academic field you go into. But remember, if you're reading a newspaper or a popular magazine or website, the audience can be pretty much anyone. It's much broader. So with the academic stuff, a certain level of knowledge about the subject matter is usually assumed. and expected, because otherwise, why are you reading it? They don't really make a profit off of those types of texts. They are academic. They are very specific to the sort of academic world and the people who work in that world. But newspapers and magazines are trying to appeal to virtually any literate adult. So that's a much broader audience, and that's going to dictate tone, style, language, maybe even intention and thesis as well. That's for you to decide. However, a lot of publications that we might find are going to be geared towards specific groups. And those groups might be classified not so much on expertise, but more based on like hobbies, shared interests. So we've all seen like hunting magazines or sports magazines or fashion magazines. Those have specific, intended audiences. Right? They are able to be understood by anyone, but most likely the people reading that stuff are interested in those particular areas. They're a sports fan. They're interested in fashion. They're a hunter or a fisherman, right? So those are typically the people who are going to pick up those magazines and read those articles. So you can always keep that in mind as well. There's also publications that are sort of geared towards certain professional groups, like teachers or software engineers or, different career fields might have their own publications, their own kind of texts that exist in those worlds. You might come across some of that stuff, and even if you don't necessarily belong to that world, you can sort of understand and identify the intended audience. Who is this for? Who is the author addressing? These are questions to ask yourself. Who is the author talking to? Who is the author really trying to reach? And it's always kind of a fun thought experiment to ask yourself, am I in the intended audience? Am I part of the intended audience that the author is trying to reach? Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes it's no. But even if you don't think you are, you can still use that source. Even if you don't really think it's intended for you, you can still summarize it, understand it, analyze it, and maybe use it. In fact, you can even talk about the fact that you feel kind of excluded from it. You're not maybe the type of person who the author intended to read this, but you are reading it. You can still read it. So even if you feel outside of the intended audience, you can do something with that. You can talk about that, think about that, and maybe form some more conclusions about that. Why aren't you a part of that audience? Do you want to be a part of that audience? Is it unfair for you to be excluded from that audience, or is it okay with you? You can answer some of those questions yourself. All right, so that's enough for those sort of concepts of advanced annotation. These are just things that I want you guys to think about, stuff that you can write notes about, and stuff that you're going to need to reflect on later when we're doing more work with our sources. So just keep this stuff in mind, write a little bit about this stuff, and ask questions about this stuff. A lot of these areas are going to be areas of inquiry, things that you can ask questions about, research more, think about more, and if you don't arrive at conclusions or answers right away, that's okay. It gets you on the right track. It's a longer process, and you might take you a while to figure it all out, but it's stuff that you need to think about. Okay, so let's move on to evidence. We're going to talk a lot about evidence over the next few weeks and really throughout the semester. Whenever we're talking about stuff like thesis, even tone, audience, bias, we're going to need to lean on evidence. What evidence is the author using to make their argument? What evidence is the author using to reach a particular audience or to persuade or inform a particular audience? We can't get very far with our source work if we're not thinking about evidence. And evidence also, finding the evidence in the text that we read, that's how we anchor everything. That's how we anchor our own opinions, our own conclusions, our own feelings. That's how we tie all of that stuff to the text. This is how we guarantee that we don't wander too far away from the text and just end up talking about what we think and how we feel. There's a place for that, but in here, we want all of our conclusions, all of our source work to be connected to the source itself, the text itself. So the points that we make, the conclusions that we arrive to, the sort of larger project that we're engaged in, it should always be tied back to some of the actual evidence that we can find in the text. And if we're looking at a text that doesn't really seem to have evidence, if it really just seems like an opinion piece, somebody talking about how they feel, what they think, but there's really no anchor to evidence, that might not be the best source for us. It might be interesting, it might be worth reading, and maybe you can do something with it, but typically we like sources that have real evidence in them. Evidence that we can find, talk about, analyze, and maybe even use for ourselves. Because you guys know that's one of the best things we can do with our sources, is find evidence, not just that the author used, but evidence that we can use ourselves to support our own arguments. So let's talk about some of the most common types of evidence that we're going to find in the sources that we read, starting with statistics. So we can also refer to this as numerical evidence. But these are like hard numbers. Any type of numerical evidence is usually pretty reliable and very useful. So any kind of statistical measure, percentages, raw numerical data, we can always use that stuff. And a lot of the authors that we read will be using that stuff, especially if you're in the science or technology fields. It's going to be a lot of emphasis on numerical evidence. Not all authors will use it the same amount, but usually, if we're finding evidence, at least some of that evidence will be numerical. Numerical. Data, hard numbers that can often be used to support larger points or claims or statements that the author might be making. So we can always look for those. They're not infallible, but typically readers will often trust numbers a little bit more than words. Words can be easily twisted or manipulated. We know that numbers can also be manipulated, but it's not quite as easy to manipulate the numbers, at least as long as you're providing necessary context. So sometimes numbers don't mean much if you just throw them in with no explanation, no larger context. But as long as you're kind of showing how the numerical data works, it's usually a very good source of evidence. Another thing that we're going to see a lot in the stuff that we read will be surveys and polls. So these are opinions or answers of a representative sample of the population. So we've all seen poll results or survey results in some form or another, and we probably know how they work, right? Usually some small group, maybe 100 people, a few hundred people, will be surveyed. They'll be asked certain questions, and then their answers are used as data. The answers to those questions will be used to represent a much larger slice of the population. So we know, if you follow, politics at all, you know that surveys and polls are often not as reliable as other kinds of sources because people don't always answer the questions honestly, and also it can be tough if you have a small sample size to really use that to predict what a much larger group of people will do. And that's a key thing to remember about surveys and polls. They are predictive. They are normally used to predict what people will do in the future. And as we know, that's a hard thing to do. People are very unpredictable. People might tell you that they're going to do one thing, and then they turn around and do the complete opposite. So any sort of predictive measure, any type of evidence that is predictive in nature, is always a little shaky because we never really know what people are going to do until they do it. But just to give you an easy example, you guys can eventually generate some surveys and polls of your own. But one thing you could do, like if you're making an argument about school, about college, about the cost of college, or some other pertinent issue that's relevant to the world of education like higher ed right now, one thing you could do to generate some evidence is to survey or poll maybe 100 college students and to ask all 100 of them 5 questions. And then you take those answers and you're able to reach conclusions. You're able to perhaps predict, future actions, what they're going to do. But one of the problems with that is you only asked 100 people. So that doesn't necessarily represent all college students throughout the country. You're sort of making a leap from the 100 people that you polled to all the other people that they're supposed to represent. So you have to be careful with this type of evidence, but it can be useful. It can at least give you some general impressions. It can at least give you a sense for what popular opinion is, right? Roughly 60 of the 100 or 75 of the 100 answered in similar ways. So that might make you comfortable enough to say, this is the majority opinion. Not everybody shares it, but if 75% of my group share it, it's probably a pretty safe assumption to say that maybe a similar percentage would also share that opinion if we took a larger sample size. But you want to be a little careful because these can be inaccurate sometimes. What we like a little bit better is our third type of evidence, examples. So we all know examples, we know the word, we hear the word, but let me give you an actual definition of what an example is and what it does. An example is a single representative instance that serves to support a larger point. That's kind of important to remember. An example is a single occurrence or a single representative instance. It's a thing that happened. But more importantly, it's a thing that happened that can support a larger argument, right? It can support a larger point. So if I'm trying to make a larger point about my students, how my students think, how they act, what they do, one of my best tools to making that argument would be providing a lot of examples, right? I'm making a larger point about the decline of study habits amongst college students. I'm not really, but just as an example of what I could be doing, if that's what I want to prove, then I need to come up with individual instances, individual occurrences of students not studying well or not studying at all. And maybe I change the names, maybe I change a few of the details to protect identities, but I provide several instances of students doing something. And then I use those individual instances to prove my larger point, which is study habits are declining. So we use examples all the time. It's kind of instinctive. If you're making an argument, you're often going to provide examples to illustrate or prove that argument. We do it all the time, but we definitely need to do it when we're making arguments of our own in this class. And see, examples are usually better than a lot of surveys or polls because they're not predictive. And not all polls are, but a lot of polls are. who are you going to vote for, right? That's the classic sort of poll that often could turn out to not be as accurate as we thought it was going to be. Because, again, we're trying to predict what people are going to do in the future. Whereas examples typically have already happened, right? So examples are a little more stable because people have already done them. Right? These are occurrences that have already happened. So we can use them to show what people are doing or what people have already done. We're not trying to predict. Instead, we're looking back on what's already happened and forming conclusions based on evidence. So we like examples. And people also like narrative. So oftentimes, extended examples will basically take the form of narratives. And we often call these anecdotes. Anecdotes take the form of a brief narrative. They tell a story. They often have characters. There's often a theme or a larger point or idea or argument that the story is trying to make. Now, these are short. They're usually very easy to understand and digest, but they're good because they can humanize examples. There's been studies that show that people always remember texts better when those texts tell them a story. We like stories. We like characters. We like people to root for. We like there to be a theme or like a larger point that we can grasp once we're finished reading. So if you really want your examples to land and to have an influence on your readers, oftentimes you want to make them anecdotes, extended examples that take the form of a story. That's going to make people remember them better. That's going to help people engage and connect with them better. And it will ultimately be useful and effective evidence. And then finally, the last one, expert opinions. We also call this appeals to authority. So you're going to find a lot of this stuff through your own research. But in the sources that you read, you'll notice that the authors that you're reading are also doing this. They are referring to other experts. They are relying on other experts who have already done a lot of work in this particular area. So, for example, the piece that we're reading here in week 2 by James Surowiecki, you're going to notice that this guy makes a lot of references to a lot of experts, other authors, other professors, other people who have written about the same topic that he's writing about. And there's a lot of different things that authors can achieve by using expert opinion. Obviously, this is good evidence. You can quote an expert or you can summarize what they've said, and often that can be used to support your own positions, your own viewpoint. But also, by using a lot of expert opinion, you, the author, are showing yourself to be knowledgeable. You're showing that you've done your homework. You have read. You've experienced these different authors. You've read their work. You know what they're saying. That shows that you're knowledgeable, you're reliable, and now your audience is more likely to believe you. So using authority helps on a lot of different levels. And sometimes this means you're quoting other people. Sometimes you're taking their ideas, putting them into your own words. Sometimes you might just lift a statistic from an expert, but you have to, of course, cite them, give them credit if the information is coming from them. You got to remember, no matter what research topic you ultimately choose in this class, you know that you're not going to be the first person who's ever written about it. So you know that there have been previous authors, previous experts who have already done a lot of work in that field. They've already done a lot of research. They've already thought about this topic. They've written about it. They've discovered evidence for their particular viewpoints. So all of that's available to you. You're not responsible for all of it. You can't use all of it, but you can use some of it. Rely on some of the good work that's already been done in that field concerning your topic. Use some of that stuff so you don't have to recreate the wheel. You don't have to start from scratch, right? Use what's come before you, and you can build a lot of your argument on top of that good previous work from previous experts, or maybe experts who are working right now. They're still working on the topic. You can use them as well. So a good way to start practicing some of these advanced annotation sort of concepts, practicing, writing about them, taking notes about them, and just thinking about them more, comes in the form of the week 2 reading. So I labeled this Reading Sources Part 2, but this is very different from the week 1 reading, which was just essentially a textbook chapter and then those 2 newspaper articles. We have a new reading here. Not a chapter, not something like we saw last week, not a newspaper article either. This comes from a longer book written by this guy, James Surowiecki, who was a finance journalist for a long time. Now he does some other things, but his background is in journalism. And as you can read about him on page 35 of the PDF, he used to work for various magazines as a journalist. He's achieved a little bit more fame in recent years for his work with collective intelligence. And you can see the title of this excerpt from his book. It's called The Wisdom of Crowds. It's an interesting piece. I want you guys to be patient with it. It might not all click together for you immediately. Read it twice if you need to. Underline stuff, write down notes, ask questions, all of that. But also think about what his thesis is. What is his intention? What is his intended audience? What's he trying to accomplish here? Do we think he has any potentially problematic bias? Let's think about all of that. Let's think about the points he's making, but also his larger purpose, his larger argument that he's trying to get across to us. And you might find the topic here to be kind of interesting. He's talking about collective intelligence and how it functions in a lot of normal, everyday situations. So essentially, he's saying that groups of people are often very intelligent. They have their own kind of intelligence, and they're capable of doing things that are very impressive even without really any planning or discussion. There's this kind of innate collective intelligence that any group of people can really, demonstrate. And he's talking about a lot of specific examples of how collective intelligence plays out in everyday life. So I'll let you guys read that and digest it, and then the next part I want us to do with Surowiecki is to watch a TED Talk that he's done. I posted it in the week 2 module, and he's still talking about collective intelligence, but he's talking about it within the context of the internet. So I think we'll have some opinions about that, and I want us to talk about it more in this week's research journal. So we're going to answer some basic advanced annotation questions about Surowiecki's work, but I also want us to just grapple with some of his ideas. What is he talking about? He's talking at a very particular point in time that's going to feel very old to a lot of you. He does that TED Talk, I think, in 2003 or maybe 2004. Long time ago. It was a very different time as far as the internet was concerned, but he was giving the talk in part as a response to a major event, a natural catastrophe that had just occurred. Huge tsunamis in the Indian Ocean. You guys can read about this. You're probably too young to remember. You probably weren't alive when this happened, unless you're more my age. I was in college when these tsunamis happened. I think there was an earthquake maybe that triggered these huge tsunamis in places like Sri Lanka and Thailand and Indonesia. And they caused a great deal of damage. A lot of people died. It was very scary. And that had just happened. when Surowiecki does this TED Talk. So he's using that example to help make a larger point about the collective intelligence found on the internet and the amazing possibilities, the amazing potential of what collective intelligence can accomplish online. So I want you to go in with that sort of basic understanding, and then you can figure out the rest. We can update a lot of what he's saying, right? He's talking about blogs. We still have blogs. But what he's not really talking about is social media, because social media in its modern form did not really exist yet when he was doing that TED Talk. So let's maybe update some of what he says about blogs, about the way people post information, the way people share things. We can online, we can update a lot of that to apply to modern social media platforms. And I think we'll be able to see that a lot of what he's talking about, even though it is old, it's still relevant today. He's really getting at some interesting stuff about how the internet works, the good parts about it, and the potential negative parts. So let's read him, let's watch his TED Talk, and then let's answer some questions so we can better understand these texts. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.